This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the third webinar for the Future Electric Utility Regulation Series. Today, the authors of our report on performance-based regulation will highlight their findings and take questions from the audience. Next slide, please. This series is designed to inform ongoing discussions and decisions by utility regulators, policies, and the electric industry at large. We use a unique point-counterpoint format to present different viewpoints on the future of utility regulation and business models, as well as the trade-offs in achieving a reliable, affordable, clean, and flexible power system. The U.S. Department of Energy funds the series, primarily the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, National Electricity Delivery Division. Next slide, please. An advisory group of state regulators, utilities, and other stakeholders in the electric industry help prioritize what topics we cover and how we cover them. This slide lists our advisory group members, and we thank them for their active participation. Next slide. Here we show the 6 reports that we've either completed or are underway so far. Additional reports in this series will be funded with support from DOE's Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium. Next slide. Before I turn over the mic for today's presentation, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. First, we're recording the webinar, and we will post it on our website. We'll provide that link again shortly and throughout the webinar. And because of the large number of participants today, everyone except for presenters is in listen mode only. So please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. And we ask that you send them along the way and not just at the very end. We will have our Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but we'd like to collate your questions and comments to help facilitate that. The presentation will take about 35 or 40 minutes, and then the authors of the report will answer your questions. Our presenters today are Mark Newton-Lowry and Tim Wolf. Mark is president of Pacific Economics Group Research. He's been active in performance-based regulatory issues since the 1990s. A former Pennsylvania State University energy economics professor, he holds a PhD in applied economics. And Tim is vice president of Synapse Energy Economics. He has 30 years of experience with utility planning and regulation. He specializes in demand-side management, integrated resource planning, performance-based rate making, and decoupling. He's a former commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, and he has a master's in business administration and a degree in mechanical engineering. Again, following their presentation, we'll respond to questions in the chat box, so please enter your questions in the chat box at any time. Next slide, please. We produced this report to have a broader understanding of comprehensive performance-based regulation and its potential role in a future where we may have high levels of distributed energy resources, including energy efficiency, distributed generation, demand response, and storage. So the purpose of the report was to illuminate key elements and the diversity of approaches to performance-based regulation, identify opportunities and challenges for performance-based regulation in a potential high PBR future, highlight strategy issues for performance-based regulation, inform regulators, utilities, and other stakeholders about how such regulation may be implemented given the unique conditions in their jurisdiction. And finally, to describe the potential advantages and disadvantages of various options from both utilities and the customer's perspectives. Next slide. Tim and Mark.
Okay, this is Mark Lowry speaking, and I'm going to kick things off by saying that to understand the appeal of performance-based approaches to rate making, it's constructive to first take a few moments to think about the incentives yielded by the traditional cost of service approach to regulation in the United States. The basics of cost of service regulation start with the fact that the base rates that address costs of labor, material, and capital inputs are adjusted in occasional rate cases that occur as they are needed. In other words, the more financial attrition the utility is subject to, the more frequently they will ask for rate cases. There are also trackers for fuel and purchase power costs. Once a revenue requirement is established, it must be allocated between the various service classes. And then the revenue requirements for base rate inputs are chiefly recovered via volumetric and demand charges, which are variable, even though the costs in question are largely fixed. So what kinds of incentive problems result from this regulatory system? Well, the incentives vary with the frequency of rate cases and the scope of cost trackers. The more financial attrition that the utility is subject to, the more frequently they will ask for rate cases, the more costs they will ask to be tracked, and the weaker, therefore, are the performance incentives. Generally speaking, there is a financial incentive to increase the rate base, and there is also a financial incentive to increase sales, the so-called throughput incentive. There is also little incentive to contain the cost of fuel and purchase power. So utilities under traditional regulation clearly have a disincentive to accommodate distributed generation and storage and demand-side management, even when these DERs can meet customer needs at lower cost. There's also a concern that rapid DER penetration by increasing rate case frequency and the scope of cost trackers can erode utility cost performance just when good performance is most needed to address competition. There was a previous incident in American utility regulation when this actually occurred back in the 1970s, when there was rapid input price inflation and a dramatic slowdown in volume growth. Electric utilities in that period suffered a dramatic decline in productivity that ultimately contributed to the restructuring of about half of the U.S. electric utility industry. So what is the performance-based alternative to traditional cost of service regulation? Generally speaking, we'll define PBR as various approaches to regulation that have in common an effort to improve utility performance with stronger incentives. A variety of mechanisms fall under this heading, and we are going to address in this webinar and in the paper that we've written the two by far most common approaches, which are multi-year rate plans and performance incentive mechanisms, also abbreviated as MRPs and Pimms. I might note that we will not be talking about another constructive approach to PBR, which would be to incentivize cost trackers and formula rates. Next slide, please. And sorry, I meant I should have asked before, but let's go on to the next slide. So we're going to devote a slide each to the two most important approaches to performance-based rate making, starting with the multi-year rate plans. And I will explain the MRPs and then turn it over to Tim to discuss the Pimms. The primary objective of a multi-year rate plan is to provide financial incentives for the utility to increase efficiency and reduce its cost. A secondary objective is to make regulation more efficient by reducing needless cost. Both of these goals can potentially benefit customers. The first by having lower costs result in lower rates, and the second by directing regulatory resources to more constructive uses such as generic proceedings and integrated resource planning. The three most essential components of a multi-year rate plan are, first of all, a rate case moratorium that typically lasts 3 to 4 years, but can sometimes be as long as 7 or 8 years. Secondly, an attrition relief mechanism, or ARM, that provides automatic relief for increasing cost pressures, but is not linked to the utility's actual costs. An example might be just deciding in advance that the utility would be given 2.5% per year revenue escalation, which is statistics have shown is about what is typically needed to cover their costs. A third vitally important component of a multi-year rate plan is some performance incentive mechanisms of the sort that Tim is going to talk about in a minute. And these typically focus on service quality to offset the temptation to reduce quality that might result under the stronger cost containment incentives of the multi-year rate plan. There are also a number of optional components that you often see in MRPs. Nowadays, in particular, revenue decoupling that can relax the link between revenue and system use that gives rise to the throughput disincentive to embrace DERs. Earnings sharing mechanisms can share in a prescribed manner deviations between the actual ROE of a utility and the target ROE that's established in the rate case. Efficiency carryover mechanisms can potentially permit the utility to keep a share of the long-term performance gains that they achieve during a plan at the conclusion of the plan. Cost trackers may be used to address certain costs that are not easy to address using the attrition release mechanisms. And finally, the utility may be accorded greater marketing flexibility in areas that the regulator believes need flexibility, such as perhaps price-sensitive large load customers, green power, or electric vehicles. Tim?
Yes, thanks, Mark. This is Tim speaking, and just a brief overview of performance incentive mechanisms. One of the key differences between these and MRPs is that they're narrowly focused on specific performance goals, specific outcomes that regulators want to see, and the financial incentives themselves are specifically associated with those goals and with regulatory targets. Pimms tend to have 4 components. The first one that's very important is the regulatory policy goals, like which areas of performance, which outputs regulators especially interested in focusing on. And then there's the metrics, which is the information and the data that helps indicate utility performance. And then there are targets where they go another step further, and the commissions say, well, for example, if we're talking about reliability, that's the regulatory policy goal. The metrics may be SAIDI and SAIFI, and the targets might be a SAIDI equal to X and a SAIFI equal to Y. And then the fourth element is financial incentives, which is based upon how well the company performs relative to those targets. Those can be both positive and negative, rewards and penalties. And it's important to recognize this can be done in several different ways. They can be implemented in stages, and in fact, the states don't have to go all the way to financial incentives. They can establish scorecards that present the metrics and present the targets, and sometimes just that alone, highlighting the information and the performance, is enough to give the utility sort of the incentive, shall we say, not financial, but the incentive to perform well and to look good in those metrics. And I will say the financial incentives, the piece that gets added on and at the end, offers the greatest incentive in terms of really making the utility act as the regulators are looking for them to act, but it also introduces the most risk, both to customers and utilities, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. Next slide.
Okay, now we want to talk about the various precedents for these 2 important approaches to PBR, and we'll start with the multi-year rate plans. MRPs have been used in the United States since the 1980s. They've been especially popular in the regulation of industries facing substantial competition, such as railroads, oil pipelines, and local telephone exchange carriers. They've been used in the U.S. electric utility industry since the 1990s. California, New York, and 2 New England states, Maine and Massachusetts, were the early adopters of MRPs. In fact, the term PBR was popularized by San Diego Gas and Electric in an MRP proposal in the early 1990s. More recently, MRPs have been used increasingly by vertically integrated electric utilities in diverse parts of the United States, including Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Washington, and Virginia. Outside of the United States, multi-year rate plans are actually the most common approach to the regulation of energy utilities today. Just taking a look at the English-speaking countries, for example, MRPs are the norm in Australia and New Zealand. In Canada, they are now being used in all 4 of the most populous provinces. And perhaps the best known practitioner of MRPs outside the United States has been Britain, where they have been used for 2 decades by Ofgem. Next slide. This is yours, Tim, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Thank you. So as Mark mentioned, Britain has a long-standing example of PBR for 20 years, and it began looking a whole lot like the PBR that we see in North America these days, but it has evolved some over those years, and especially in the past few years, they created what they call RIO, which stands for Revenue Equals Incentives plus Innovation plus Outputs. We mention it here because it's gotten a lot of attention in the literature in the U.S. And some of the key features of the RIO plan are that it's an 8-year term between rate cases, which is particularly long. It includes revenue decoupling. I think it's included that for many years. The attrition relief mechanism gets a lot of attention, and it's based upon detailed cost forecasts for the utilities expenditures throughout 8 years looking forward. And in doing those estimates, they use extensive statistical benchmarking and engineering analyses to make sure they have some confidence, as much as they can, about those cost forecasts for 8 years. They also have some interesting elements, including an incentive-compatible menu so that utility can actually choose either a plan with lower allowed revenues, but with the ability to keep a larger portion of cost savings. That would be chosen in the case of a utility who thought that they could do very well and significantly increase their efficiencies. Or a utility could choose higher revenues, but with a lower proportion of any savings. So that just creates a bit more flexibility, hopefully to make more, give utilities more incentive to get the right revenue forecast for their needs. There's also a very detailed system of performance metrics and performance incentive mechanisms, much broader than we've seen in the U.S. And they also have a TOTEX approach, and this comes about because, as you know, in North America, the utilities rate of return is based upon rate base, which includes capital expenditures and not operating expenditures, and this creates one of the incentives to maximize rate base and maximize capital expenditures. And it also creates a bias when a utility is thinking of different types of costs, a bias towards capital expenditures. So the concept of the TOTEX approach, which stands for total expenditures, is that the rate of return is based upon the total expenditures, both operating and capital expenditures. So if we have a chance later on, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the advantages and disadvantages, but this is the gist of the RIO approach. Next
Tim,
slide.
I realize that we passed over your brief discussion of the precedents for performance incentive mechanisms. Would you care to comment on that now?
Yes, thank you, Mark. My apologies for that. So just briefly, Pimms have been used for many years. It's not something new, even though it's gotten a lot of attention lately. As Mark mentioned, it has a lot of experience with multi-year rate plans where there's a risk of service quality degrading. So they were put in, and they put in Pimms relating to reliability and customer satisfaction and so forth to avoid service degradation. And it turns out that over time, the most widely used PIM in the United States has been for demand-side management. I'm sure you're all familiar with the shareholder incentives associated with energy efficiency programs. Those are an example of PIMs, and there's actually some good lessons from those experiences, both positive and negative. Thank you. So now we need to go down 2 slides. So this chart is really just to make one general point, which is that there's many combinations of these different rate-making elements. There's no one single formula here. So on the left-hand column, we list the various rate-making elements that are typically used in some way in performance-based regulation. The rate case moratorium is pretty much essential to MRPs, but then all the other ones are used in different combinations in different states. Cost of service rate making doesn't typically have these, but it might have some marketing and pricing flexibility. Revenue regulation or decoupling at the bottom can be applied in any one of these contexts. But the key thing, and standalone Pimms, they can be done by themselves, but they can also be done in combination with MRPs. And then for RIO, there's a couple of clearly defined elements that we highlight here to show how that differs from some of the variations we see in the states. And again, the main point of this is just to distinguish when we talk later on about Pimms and MRP, how they're different, but also how there's lots of moving parts here that get put together by different states in different ways. Next slide. So we're going to go over both MRPs and Pimms, and we're going to talk a bit about customers' perspective and a bit about utilities' perspectives. And I will say at the outset that it's not easy to put the perspectives in these simple buckets. And as you know, in reality, things are more complex than that. But we've done this to try to lay out the points and the counterpoints from these perspectives. So for multi-year rate plans, there are several advantages. In theory, they're intended to improve utility performance and lower costs. And ideally, these benefits can be shared with customers. They result in less frequent rate cases, typically, especially in areas where load is not growing or even declining. And this allows regulators more time and attention for other matters. They can also improve the transparency of information, especially in developing the attrition relief mechanisms. There's a lot of information that comes forward about how well the utility is performing relative to peers. And it can encourage the implementation of cost-effective DERs. We'll talk more about this later. And they can be implemented gradually. One could start with a relatively short rate period just to test it out and see how it works, and then over time increase the rate periods to see how it might work once the foundations are set in place. There are disadvantages from the customer's perspective. Typically the ARM results in an automatic rate increase every year between rate cases. And without that, under cost of service rate making, you see flat rates. This is just base rates, of course. So that's a downside. On the other side of that, though, once you do have a new rate case for at the end of the rate term, ideally those rate increases would be lower than it would be otherwise because you've had rate increases between rate cases. There may be situations, in fact you would expect situations, where the revenues the utility recover exceeds the cost for certain periods between rate cases, because that's the whole idea. A utility will be able to push down its cost and keep that difference in between the cost and the revenues. Fewer rate cases actually means less frequent opportunities to review costs, and this could be a big disadvantage to consumer advocates and to regulators, because it's important to have the opportunity to look under the hood and see what utilities' costs are and are not. And it should be pointed out that the ARM design methods are not simple. They can be opaque, very complex, controversial, so it's not an easy thing to set up. And because of all this, interveners may lack the resources and the skills needed to effectively protect consumers at the time the MRPs are put in place. Next slide, and turn it to Mark.
Okay, lots of pros and cons of MRPs from the standpoint of the utility, starting with the advantages. MRPs can provide utilities with timely, predictable revenue growth. There's an opportunity not otherwise available for superior returns to be earned over an extended period for superior performance. There's also a greater chance for marketing flexibility. And this is particularly valuable for vertically integrated electric utilities for two reasons. One is that price-sensitive large load customers account for a larger share of the margin of these utilities. Secondly, these utilities, because they retain the monopoly on power supply, potentially have more to gain from offering customers varied green power and electric vehicle options. However, power distributors also benefit from electric vehicle and green power sales, not just because they bolster margins, but because they can build loyalty to grid services in the longer run. And all utilities can benefit from value-added services made possible by distributed storage, AMI, and other smart grid facilities today. So also improved performance can be an important new earnings driver at a time when some utilities have diminished investment opportunities. Better performance, as discussed earlier, is particularly valuable in a period of mounting competition. Also, better performers are more likely to make successful mergers and acquisitions, and even to compete better in unregulated markets. For example, if you look at some of the big successful energy companies in the U.S. electric power industry today, they include companies like Duke, Mid-American Energy, and NextEra Energy that grew out of a utility that operated for a decade or more without a general rate case. Another thing that's beneficial for the utility is that they don't have to worry about having the resources to put together an effective proposal and to try to get it approved by the regulator. They can hire the expertise that they need for this if they don't have it in-house. Also, utilities that own, companies that own multiple utilities or utilities in different states can particularly benefit from the streamlining of regulation that MRPs make possible. Now, saying all this doesn't mean that MRPs are necessarily a great deal for the utility, and in fact, outside of the United States, the impetus for MRPs has typically come from policymakers rather than the utilities themselves. There can be a material increase in operating risk for the utility for a number of reasons. It's very difficult, for example, to have an MRP that magically gives the company revenue for every cost bump that they might experience and still maintain strong performance incentives. Also, MRPs raise issue of the current operating efficiency of the utility when it comes time to decide on a future revenue trajectory. Of course, this wouldn't matter as much if the utility was given a higher allowed ROE to compensate for the higher risk. But this is almost unheard of, at least in the United States. The one silver lining to that cloud is that this is one area of alt-reg where there is not a risk of a reduced ROE as a consequence of getting it, something you might run into with revenue decoupling or a cost tracker. Next slide, please.
So turning to Pimms, and before I do that, I want to make one follow-up comment to Mark, which was he mentioned that utilities are rarely the impetus of multi-year rate plans, and I think that's also true for consumer advocates. They're not typically the ones who were asking for multi-year rate plans for the reasons and the disadvantages I described. So the impetus for these have typically come from regulators and other industry advocates more so than either the consumers or the utilities. So turning to Pimms, there are several advantages. I think the one that really stands out is that it's much more likely to lead to better performance in a specific area of concern, whether it's reliability or promoting energy efficiency or others, or promoting DERs. There's a greater chance because of the focus of the PIM. It can make regulatory goals explicit and the incentives as well. It can help mitigate utility bias toward capital investments. It can be designed to directly benefit customers depending upon how it's designed. It can help ensure, as we mentioned earlier, that cost cutting doesn't result in degraded service quality. And PIMs for distributed energy resources can be designed to help encourage cost-effective DERs. And metrics, especially before you even move to the financial or incentives, really are a low-risk, low-cost option for highlighting and monitoring key performance areas. There are disadvantages. I want to be clear that PIMs are not simple. to design and to implement. They do require regulatory oversight. They can be complex and contentious, and they can require a lot of resources from regulators and other stakeholders. And as a result, they can distract parties from more important issues. There are several pitfalls associated with Pimms in terms of favoring utilities or being open to gaming, leading to unintended consequences. If we have a chance, we'll talk more about these later. Also, the incentives are typically relatively small compared to the incentives under MRPs. So that might not get you as far as you'd like. And you can't have a PIM for every area of performance. If you did, it would be just a difficult regulatory job. So there's a risk of shining too much emphasis, too much light on one area at the risk of other areas not being properly served. Next slide.
Okay, the PIMs have a lot of advantages from the standpoint of electric utilities. For one, they can alert utility managers to areas that are of special concern to regulators and customers. It's always good to have good relations with both of these influential groups. They can provide the utilities with new earnings opportunities, and oftentimes in areas where earnings opportunities are not otherwise available, such as the containment of the cost of fuel and purchase power. PIMs for DSM and many experimental metrics are likely to involve rewards and no penalties. So generally speaking, the risks and rewards are in balance from the standpoint of the utility. Also, sometimes having a PIM or two is the price of admission for access to desirable forms of regulation like multi-year rate plans or formula rates. On the downside, the biggest problem is that financial rewards are likely to be small due to low stakes and the narrow focus of the PIMs. So this is not likely to be a financially transformative experience for the utility. Some PIMs involve only penalties, and some PIMs may address areas that are largely outside of utility control. Some targets may be unreasonably difficult to meet. And generally speaking, it is possible to have such a profusion of performance metrics, targets, and PIMs that they actually distract managers from their core goals. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to have a couple of slides now that talk about key challenges in the design of MRPs and of PIMs. And we'll start with the MRP topic. Just a reminder that the whole idea of an MRP is to stimulate stronger general performance incentives that then produce cost savings that can be shared with the customer. Sounds like a great idea in practice, but there are some problems going down that road. And one is that the ARMs are complex. And since there's a lot of money riding on them, the design of ARMs can engender controversy and a certain amount of posturing, just as you see with the establishment of target returns on equities in rate cases. It's not always the case that there is increased efficiency that can be shared with customers. Another possible problem is that the utility might unduly defer capital expenditures. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, deferring CapEx can be a good thing as long as service quality doesn't suffer and cost savings are shared with customers. The Brooklyn Queen Demand Management PIM of Consolidated Edison, for example, is expressly devoted to a desirable deferral of CapEx. The problem occurs, however, if potentially customers do not benefit from the deferral and the utility is in effect charged twice for the same CapEx. Now, there are provisions of MRPs that are designed to address problems like these and ensure benefits for customers. For example, when the ARM is based on indexing research, customers can be guaranteed the benefit of productivity gains achieved by the industry as a whole. What other approach to regulation makes that sort of a promise? Additionally, a stretch factor can be added to the X factor in one of those ARMs in order to ensure customers the benefit of productivity growth that's superior to the industry norm. Additionally, benefits can be shared by not having rate cases too frequently, too infrequently, should I say, and by having a earnings sharing mechanism. The problem with these devices, though, is first of all, consumer advocates and regulators may be uncertain if they're actually effective. For example, sometimes they're unsure about an appropriate industry productivity growth target. And also, some of the provisions, like more frequent rate cases and earnings sharing mechanisms, weaken the performance incentives that are intended to encourage better performance. Next slide, please.
So similarly, performance incentive mechanisms have several challenges. I refer to them as pitfalls. Most of these arise as a result of financial rewards and penalties, because as I said earlier, once you introduce those, suddenly the stakes are higher and the risk of these kind of pitfalls is much greater. And I'm not going to be able to go through all these solutions due to time, but I'm just going to mention what the challenges are. First one, we call overcompensation. I think a better term is disproportionate rewards, because it can be overcompensation or undercompensation. Either one might be problematic. Unintended consequences can happen when there is too much focus on one area and utility underperforms in other areas. And it's a variety of ways that things can happen that aren't anticipated. Uncertainty is a big issue because there's a lot often of data items and elements included in Pimms that aren't always clearly defined up front, or over time it becomes clear that there needs to be more certainty and more definition, and so over time there might be disproportionate rewards because of the uncertainty up front. And then gaming and manipulation is a big problem. There are examples of where this has occurred. It's been documented, and commissions have responded to those. And so it needs to be designed carefully and monitored. So the takeaway from this slide is that while Pimms do have some advantages, they're not going to result in less regulatory oversight. They typically result in quite a bit more. And in order to avoid all these pitfalls, they need to be well designed and monitored over time. Next slide.
Okay, the penultimate slide addresses the important question for the context of this study of how PBR can provide improved guidance in a high DER future. How does it actually deliver the goods of getting utilities to embrace efficient DER? Well, let's take a look first of all at how MRPs do this and how a standalone Pimms might accomplish this, and we'll see if the incentives are satisfactory. Starting with the MRPs, you can bolster the incentives to embrace DERs by revenue decoupling to eliminate the throughput disincentive. Additionally, as we've discussed, MRPs provide strengthened general incentive to contain for the utility to contain costs, including very definitely CapEx. In the paper, I discussed, for example, the experience of Central Maine Power that operating under 3 or 4 successive multi-year rate plans reduced their capital spending remarkably. Another thing you can do to tilt the playing field in favor of DER solutions would be to allow cost tracker treatment for the expenses incurred, such as those for demand-side management projects. On the other hand, a utility under a typical MRP does not keep the benefits of reduced fuel or purchase power costs due to cost trackers. And although there is a stronger and there is a positive incentive to contain capital spending, it's never going to be as great as it could be in a competitive market. Now, moving over to look at standalone Pimms, a Pimm for demand-side management or for distributed generation and storage can provide clear targets and incentives regarding DERs. And incentives can be bolstered by adding a revenue decoupling mechanism and perhaps also the tracking of DER-related expenses. This is what has traditionally been called the 3 legs of the DSM stool in the United States. On the other hand, the financial incentives of Pimms for DERs may not be strong enough to incentivize the right behavior. And there can certainly be a significant regulatory oversight. For example, as Tim alluded to, the design of some DER-related Pimms can be quite complicated. So the takeaway from this is really that the state-of-the-art way to incentivize stronger embrace of DERs is to combine Pimms for DERs with the multi-year rate plan. Those Pimms should not necessarily be limited just to demand-side management. The new areas where more Pimms are needed for all utilities, if you're going to embrace efficient DER, would be to extend the Pimms to also address peak load management and potentially also distributed generation and storage. Next slide.
So to bring a lot of this together, we use this chart here, and you probably got the message, I hope, from the past discussion that this isn't a simple question, and that what works best in each state might depend upon the context of that state, and it might depend upon the goals of that state. So let's try to put this somewhat into these pieces into perspective. We've got one column here on the left talking about what are the performance improvement goals of any one state. And then the column in the middle talks about how open that state is to regulatory change. And then we list the PBR options that might make sense in those contexts. So the first one, there's always a situation where states are content with performance improvement goals, the utilities are working just fine, and they have a low tolerance for regulatory change, and you can always keep current practice. That's always an option. In those states where there's a desire for improvement in specific performance areas and the tolerance for regulatory change is kind of low, then you could adopt Pimms, and they're fairly low risk, require low regulatory modifications for those specific areas. The state's looking for general improvement in utility performance, overall efficiency and overall costs, streamlined regulation, and they have a moderate to high tolerance, then an MRP makes sense. If the state wants to support DERs, but they have a low tolerance, then maybe Pimms for DER or revenue regulation would make sense. If they have a moderate tolerance, then maybe Pimms for DERs and revenue regulation. And then finally, if a state wants to do all of the above, support DERs, general improvement, utility performance, so forth, and it has a high tolerance for regulatory change, then they could look at the whole ball of wax, Pimms, MRP, and revenue regulation. And even then, there's a variety of options within that construct. So again, this was just to try to make the point that each state has to sort of work out what makes sense for them given their context. And with that, I think we should probably stop with the formal presentation for time.
Great. Thanks, Mark and Tim. We have a lot of great questions, and so we'll try to get through as many as possible. And we plan to run past the top of the hour in order to get through questions. So for those of you who can stick with us, that's great. But right before we start our Q&A session, I want to first mention that you can sign up for our regulatory and policy issues list at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to learn about additional reports and webinars in our future electric utility regulation series. And we've just posted the link again, I believe, in the chat box. Our upcoming reports in this series include distribution system pricing, recovery of fixed utility costs, and resource planning. And we've been advised that DOE is continuing to fund this series now through its Grid Modernization Lab Consortium. So we're very grateful for that. All right, so we've got so many great questions. Let's start with this one. Do we have enough history with performance-based regulation to know whether or not utilities on average can expect to earn less, the same, or more than historical norms under a full-blown PBR system?
Well, in as much as it said full-blown PBR system, meaning, I guess, an MRP, I would just comment that no, I don't think any study has ever been done of that sort. I have, in my presentation, implied that I think that Pimms, that standalone Pimms probably are likely to bolster utility earnings and provide a positive, a constructive balance between risk and return. But as for the multi-year rate plans, I don't think anyone has ever really gone back to address that in a systematic way.
All right, we've got a question about credit rating. Utilities might argue that performance incentive mechanisms would impact their credit rating because of a lack of confidence that the utility would be able to earn an adequate return. So what could you say about this?
I'll chime in. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question because it depends upon how the performance incentive mechanism is designed. In many cases, there have been positive financial rewards for performance incentive mechanisms. In fewer cases, there are penalties. Typically, the penalties might be for things like reliability that falls short and things of great importance to the regulators. And I have never seen any documentation of how the risk of those financial penalties would really impact credit rating. I mean, it's possible, and it may be if there's several Pimms added together and a utility is really performing badly, then that may be true. But to be honest, if the Pimms are well designed, then they'd only be seeing financial penalties if they're performing poorly. And so maybe that would be not so much the reason for the bad credit rating, but maybe it'd be the poor performance. That's the real reason.
Yeah, I might comment briefly that I have rarely, if ever, seen the kind of people that talk about utility risks and credit ratings speak in a derogatory way about PBR. They usually deem it a constructive addition to regulation. Might be an exception in some of the countries where, as I've said, there have been some utilities that have sued their regulators for plans that they don't like. Although even there, sometimes the credit agencies say that they believe they'll ultimately be able to work it out.
All right, our next question is the following. Both MRPs and Pimms seem to leave relatively intact the Avery-Johnson incentive for the utility to build rate base. How do we overcome this challenge?
Well, I would say that the whole idea is to erode the Avery-Johnson effect. The multi-year rate plans have been shown to be particularly effective in doing that. In the paper, for example, as I mentioned, there is the experience of Central Maine Power that really economized on their CapEx under a series of MRPs. And as for the demand-side management Pimms, I mean, they are also intended to erode that incentive. I mean, oftentimes, the demand-side management Pimm is combined with the revenue regulation. And so why is it there? Well, it's there to erode the Avery-Johnson effect by providing a positive incentive for the utility to contain its cost. Tim, do you have a comment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big issue that people are wrestling with. And I think Mark put it correctly when he said that these efforts kind of erode the effect, and if these particular measures were designed in a certain way, they could erode them more. Like one example, in Britain with Rio, they do have a much greater share of their revenues coming from the performance incentive mechanisms. And also there are other features that could be brought in. So there may be pros and cons to it, but the TOTE-X approach that I described that combines both operating and capital cost and setting rate of return is designed specifically to address that Avery-Johnson effect. So that kind of a mechanism might help in North America as well.
All right, here's a question. How do less frequent rate cases benefit customers under an MRP approach?
Well, it's the less frequent rate cases is a key part of the reason that there are stronger performance incentives. And as I've discussed, there are various ways that customers can share in the benefits, either at the rate case at the end, through an earnings sharing mechanism, or through a stretch factor that slows the escalation in allowed revenue. Also, the reduced frequency of rate cases permits the regulatory community to redeploy and spend more time on areas that customers should really care about, such as integrated resource planning and various generic proceedings, because there are lots of issues facing the industry today.
Well, I'll just add, just to make sure that the question is directly answered, imagine a utility is able to have a rate case every single year. It has no incentive to control costs because it knows that it will recover them right away. Whereas if it has to wait 5 years or more, then suddenly any difference between its allowed revenues and its actual cost, it can save. And it's that creates the incentive behind MRPs.
Great, thanks. Are there any parallels to multi-year rate plans and performance incentive mechanisms that can be applied to managing municipal utilities or rural electric co-ops?
Well, in Canada, they routinely apply PBR and multi-year rate plans to publicly owned utilities. In the province of Ontario, for example, there's something like 70 power distributors. Most of those are municipals, and some of them are rather large, like Toronto Hydroelectric. And the PBR is applied to those utilities. Similarly, in Australia, a number, maybe even half of the power distributors subject to multi-year rate plans are public enterprises such as Networks New South Wales. So, I think they can be applied. I think that studies, the jury is out, or there's been no real studies to see how a publicly held utility responds to the stronger incentives. I will say this, that sometimes my experience from Ontario is that sometimes they're less inclined to oppose the provisions of the plan because they could always get more money by another means.
Great, thanks. What do you see as the biggest barriers to implementation of comprehensive performance-based regulation? And as part of your response, if you could address whether you think Wall Street is comfortable with utility performance being meaningfully affected, with utility performance meaningfully affecting earnings up or down.
Tim, you want to start on that one?
I'll start. It's a tough question. I don't mean to be facetious, but I think one of the biggest barriers is our inability to see the future, which means that regulators and consumer advocates are reluctant to embark upon a regulatory plan that kind of relies to some extent on forecast, and this often pre-approval, it's not necessary, but pre-approval of capital expenditures is often a part of multi-year rate plans. And that's a fundamental philosophical shift from how we've done things under cost of service rate making. Now, some states have made that shift, and they use future test years, and they use multi-year rate plans, but others do not. And I think, at least from the consumer's perspective, that's a big barrier to get across. If we all had crystal balls, it would be different. There are other barriers, but that's a big one.
I would make the comment that there's more of a problem with agreeing on the terms of a plan for many power distributors today than there is for vertically integrated utilities, and that's because many of the power distributors in the eastern United States, for example, just starting to face more competition from distributed generation and storage, but meanwhile they believe that they need accelerated capital spending to not only to install all sorts of new smart grid facilities, but also just to get caught up on some of their replacement of existing plant. And regulators are, they're not accustomed to getting these proposals, and it's hard for them sometimes to accept the fact that, although there hasn't been a lot of capital spending in the last 15 years, that suddenly they need 5 years of very high spending. And so they're reluctant to sign off on a MRP if that MRP is going to finance this accelerated capital spending. Whereas with the vertically integrated utilities, first of all, there is actually a slowdown in capital spending of most vertically integrated utilities today, because with the slower demand growth, there is less need for new generating capacity. Not only that, but a lot of the new generating capacity is purchased rather than built. The other thing about the vertically integrated utilities is that the regulators in most states that regulate these utilities have a lot of experience with thinking about whether they actually need to build new capacity, and so they're more comfortable signing off on a multi-year plan where the bigger cost bumps that are at issue is new generating capacity.
So here's another question. The utility often or generally has more information regarding actual costs and potentially how to set appropriate performance metrics than the regulator. How can we avoid gaming of the system if we implement performance incentive metrics or multi-year rate plans that might use those?
Tim, you want to start off on that?
Well, I'll start, and it actually follows on from what I mentioned earlier about reluctance to forecast the future. Yes, utilities do have better information, and there are regulators and consumer advocates need to have the resources to respond to that. I would like to add, like in Rio, where they have an 8-year forecast of capital costs, and they're expecting basically to pre-approve those, which in my mind is breathtaking when you think of the uncertainty over the next 8 years. It took them 30 months, I believe, to work out the first plan, and the regulator, Ofgem, has staff of I think it's on the order of 400 staff people working on it. I'm not sure the exact number, but it's very high. So that's a big barrier to moving forward on this, is the complexity. What the solution is, maybe Mark can expand, but in general there are mechanisms and tools for benchmarking across utilities and for providing engineering analyses to do the best you can with what forecasts you do have.
Yes, and I would just say this goes back to my comment about the accelerated modernization programs of power distributors today, and how the biggest challenge with the spread of PBR to those distributors is kind of how to finesse and how to help the various parties to regulation to come to an agreement as to what might be needed in the way of supplemental capital spending. It's certainly a challenge, and it's really the cutting edge issue. Whereas I don't see it as being as much of a problem for the vertically integrated utilities. That incentive compatible menu is what they did in Britain after many experiences of the utility. What happened there actually is the utility would come in and say, "Oh my gosh, we need a whole bunch of new capital spending." They would get the money for it, and then they didn't do it. And so then eventually they came up with this very elaborate scheme in which the regulator basically invested a great deal of time and money in developing independent engineering and benchmarking capabilities to develop their own opinion as to what the revenue requirement would be. And now in Britain, the utility's own cost forecast has only a modest weight on the revenue requirement that's ultimately chosen.
I've got a really specific question for you. How many basis points or what range should be tied to a performance incentive mechanism to effectuate change?
So I'll jump into that one. You know, that's something that really should depend upon the performance incentive mechanism. And I recommend that the financial rewards and penalties be looked at comprehensively. So one should look at not just basis points, but like what percent of revenues does that represent, and how many dollars does that represent, and then use those metrics to compare to the type of impact or outcome you're trying to achieve. So for example, with energy efficiency shareholder incentives, I like to make sure that whenever one is designing one, you identify, what's the dollar value, what's the basis points, what's the percent of revenue, and then compare that to the energy efficiency budgets themselves and the potential energy efficiency benefits. To make sure, one key theme here is that in any performance incentive mechanism, you want it to work out where the benefits to customers outweigh the costs and where the costs are those financial rewards.
I would just make the comment that the proper basis points varies a lot with other features of the regulatory system. For example, when the utility has a tracker or a formula rate that addresses the cost that's required to achieve the goal, the supplemental incentive is much lower than if the opposite is the case. When you hear about, for example, about the the relatively high weights or stakes involved in the Pimms in Rio, well, most of those have to do with the fact that it's an 8-year plan where there's strong cost containment, so you don't get a dollar-for-dollar recovery of your line maintenance expenses. So that's why, and that's a big part of why the weights are so high. Whereas, let's say you're under a formula rate where you can get close to full recovery of all of your costs, then the need for hefty reliability and service quality incentives is substantially reduced.
Okay, we're going to go past the top of the hour here for those of you who can stay with us to get through more of these questions. So here's a question about, have you considered, you the authors of this report, considered developing objective metrics that could be used to assess the performance of these kinds of alternative regulatory approaches? And the person asking this question is saying there's so much emphasis on commodity price comparisons and little emphasis paid to the cost of electric service to consumers, innovation, and increasing customer choices.
Well, I mean, the United States is remarkably backward in its use of benchmarking in regulation. It's one of the most backward, if not the most backward, of all the advanced industrial countries. So much more could be done in the area of cost benchmarking, for example, than is done. I mean, in other countries where they have MRPs, it's an integral part of the regulatory process, so that a lot is known about that. As for reliability, that's been hard to compare for a long time because of the lack of standardized reliability metrics. But there is now, the U.S. government is now stepping in and starting to collect standardized reliability data that for the first time makes it possible to use data in the public domain to compare the reliability of utilities. Service quality is still hard to compare across utilities because of the lack of standardized data.
So I would just add that I agree that we could use a lot more data to answer the questions of how well are these mechanisms performing. There's enough experience now with performance-based rate making in North America that, given the resources, one could go back and look at how capital expenditures how it changed or didn't change, how performance changed and didn't change. It would be a fantastic exercise, but I don't think it's been done.
Are you aware of any jurisdictions where regulators have tried these kinds of mechanisms, multi-year rate plans and performance incentive mechanisms, and then reverted back to more traditional regulation? And can you say why that happened?
Yeah, I'll start. I know of one in particular, which is Maine, where they were one of the first innovators with MRPs. They had an alternative rate plan back in the mid-90s with restructuring, and they had several plans, several rate terms over which it occurred, and it seemed to be going fairly well. However, I guess about 2 years ago now, maybe a year and a half, Central Maine Power filed a rate case where they pointed out, and they basically highlighted one of the limits that we spoke about earlier with MRPs. They needed a major capital investment for their data processing equipment, and it just didn't fit very well within the MRP attrition release mechanism, and so there was a lot of back and forth during the rate case. Mark and I were both engaged in it about what to do with that. And in the end, there was a settlement, and I don't know how willing the company was, but the parties agreed to revert back to traditional rate making and forego MRP because of this, I think, really this one-off issue that wasn't really resolved well. Doesn't mean it couldn't have been, but it wasn't, and so that was the outcome in that one case.
Well, and I could speak to what I would say about Maine, that it's just an example of what I was speaking to about how regulators and stakeholders balk at accelerated capital spending programs. There was no rule for CMP not to save CapEx for a lot of years and then ask for more CapEx. That was not forbidden, or they weren't advised not to do that in advance. But then when it came that time that was the only way that the plan could continue, the other parties were just reluctant to sign off on it. Tim could also speak better than me probably to Massachusetts, where it used to be that many or most of the companies operated under multi-year rate plans, and two things happened. One, there were some poorly designed gas plans that didn't anticipate either the declining average use in the gas industry of the residential and commercial customers, or the need for accelerated CapEx, safety-related CapEx. And when they came in and asked to have some supplemental revenue for that, the plans died. Now, that was not a good reason to deny MRPs for the power distributors, but the power distributors in Massachusetts, many of them do need the accelerated CapEx right now, or at least they say they do. And so the commission and stakeholders have generally been opposed to MRPs there. What they've gotten instead is, and at least in the case of National Grid, is a broad-based cost tracker for the capital spending. I'm at a loss to know how that helps consumers, but that's the decision that they took.
Thanks. Is there a handbook available for regulators that shows how to implement these approaches, MRPs and Pimms, and where can folks find that?
Well, at the risk of shameless self-promotion, Synapse released a handbook on Pimms back in March 2015, and you can find it on our website, and it's cited in our report here. So that's one that's out there.
Yeah, and we have a Pacific Economics Group just finished a report, a sort of a handbook on Pimms for electric utilities that's available to members of the Edison Electric Institute.
All right, we'll go through a few more questions here. Is there any data to show the effects of these mechanisms on utility share prices and stock value?
There again, I don't think that there's really been comprehensive studies of that to my knowledge. Tim, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I have not seen it either, and I haven't seen the issue being raised as one of the barriers, but that doesn't mean it isn't. I just haven't seen it.
Right. Have you discussed with any of the the big accounting firms to see what elements in multi-year rate plans or performance incentive mechanisms might cause the utility to not qualify for certain accounting treatment that they wish to they cite a very specific accounting treatment, SFAS 71.
That's a very good question. Back in the early days of multi-year rate plans, there was some discussion about that, but it has never gotten to the point where revenues are sufficiently divorced from a utility's cost that anyone has seriously contemplated abandoning SAS-type standards. So that topic has not come up in a long time, and not the least of the reason being that the renewed interest in multi-year rate plans is a fairly new phenomenon, mostly affecting vertically integrated utilities, and it just hasn't really arisen yet as an issue.
All right, here's a really provocative question. Since we all suffer from an inability to see the future, why isn't the solution more restructuring and fewer regulatory fixes? You know, if more of the future risks are in the private sector, then those parties will take the risks and reap the rewards, and consumers will benefit from the successful companies.
That is a big one. I'll start. I'm sure Mark will have things to add. In my view, the markets have value in certain areas, but there are limitations to what markets can do. I think with a lot of what we're working with here, there's only so much the markets can do. And we've already in many states spun off generation to the wholesale markets. That's had some successes and some not so much successes. Going even further just creates more challenges, and I personally, and I'm just speaking for myself, am not convinced that markets alone are going to be able to address some of the challenges facing utilities. If we're thinking of DERs especially, I don't see markets as delivering the kind of all cost-effective energy efficiency that we see coming from leading states. We might have the same issues with demand response, and DG, maybe there's a role there for markets. So I think the answer is not simple, but in general, I'd be wary of assuming that the markets are going to be able to do everything, because in a regulated world such as this, that's often not the case.
Well, I would make a few comments, and one is that we are, in fact, witnessing new competition for utility services today from distributed generation and storage. It's a healthy new form of competition, and and that's likely to go forward in many states. I would wonder how much competition could really be injected in the power distribution business, which does seem to have many attributes of a natural monopoly beyond, as I say, the types of competition that are already underway from distributed generation and storage. And that leaves the vertically integrated utilities. Of course, there could be some benefits in the form of competition from restructuring of the utility distribution companies, but there are reasons why about half of the states in the union decided not to go that route, not the least being the very volatile prices that are obtained in bulk power markets. They're looking today because of low gas prices, but it wasn't that long ago that in a place like the northeastern United States that those the gas prices were high and bulk power market prices were also very high.
Danielle, I wonder if you could...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tim, but in the meantime, Danielle, can you move to slide 24, please? Go ahead, Tim.
So just to respond to the question about markets and competition, yes, distributed generation could play a huge role in offering lower cost opportunities to, reduce costs, reduce distribution costs. And however, the reaction, as I'm sure most of you know, in the past few years, from regulators and utilities, has been to protect the utility from the potential for losing significant revenues by changing rate design to limit and even prevent that kind of competition from happening. This is a nice lead into your fourth report about pricing and rate design for distributed energy resources. But the reason I mention all that is that if regulators are not willing to put utilities at risk of that kind of competition, and there may be very good reasons why they won't, then there's going to be a limit to how much it's going to be able to really change the system. I think we all recognize that if we're going to move towards a really high DER future with high distributed generation, we need to have very thoughtful regulatory solutions which haven't necessarily been fully identified yet.
So we're on slide 24, Tim and Mark, and we actually did get a question in the chat box. This is an additional slide section we didn't have time to go through, but the question came in: what can the U.S. learn from Britain's Rio approach? So if you could take a couple minutes, maybe go through the slide, that'd be great.
Tim, you want to take a start on that?
Sure. First of all, one lesson that I've learned, and this is speaking for myself, is because I've been watching it from afar over many years, is that they've had some challenges, so we say, with their initial PBR designs, and what RIO is, it's an attempt to address those with additional mechanisms and additional measures to improve upon what they've done, which is great, it's laudable, but it does imply that in the absence of those measures, some of those lessons learned, the United States regulators might suffer from the same experiences. So there are several parts of RIO that are certainly worth considering. We described earlier the menu approach in designing the attrition relief mechanisms, the TOTEX approach to setting revenue requirements where rate of return is based upon total expenditures, capital and operating, the inflation indexing of revenue requirements just adds a bit more strength to the forecasts of capital expenditures. And they also have a system where the utilities can get fast-tracked regulatory treatment. They can get quicker approval from the regulators if their proposals are deemed to be reasonable, and there's probably a whole lot more about how that definition, how that finding is determined. But that's the concept, so that they don't have years and years of protracted debates about what the proper mechanism should be for every utility there. There are some aspects that raise concerns, might not be worth considering here. As I described earlier, the business plans that they put together were highly complex, very burdensome. The 8-year concept has stronger incentives, but then it has this other side which requires quite a bit of regulatory input and stakeholder input. And I'm not certain that the UK has the kind of consumer advocacy role that has representation that we have in North America, and so it may be even more difficult in North America to get business plans like that agreed to. And as I mentioned earlier, this is essentially a pre-approval of investments, which, as you know, is very difficult for commissioners and consumer advocates to agree to. And a concern that I have is looking out 8 years, who knows what new technologies will be relevant even 5 years from now. And I'm concerned that there's a lock-in of existing technologies or those anticipated over the next year or two, but it doesn't give the flexibility for those. And people should always keep in mind that there are several advantages that we have based upon our experience over RIO that we don't want to lose, such as the attrition relief mechanisms based upon indexing, using productivity factors and so forth, and better benchmarking relative to peer utilities and other similar utilities.
I might just chime in that I think that some people may incorrectly come away from RIO with the idea that it somehow presages a new approach to regulation in the United States where a whole bunch of Pimms with heavy financial stakes are added to existing regulation. And I don't think that's really what RIO is all about. I mean, there are some high financial stakes on some of the Pimms in RIO, but most of those are the result of the fact that it's a multi-year rate plan with an 8-year term. So naturally there's going to be some pretty strong incentives not to cut service quality. And then there is this information quality incentive, which in this presentation we've been calling the incentive compatible menu, which is designed to try to get the utilities to make reasonable cost forecasts for the determination of the multi-year revenue requirement. So all of those things with the heavyweights are mostly about the fact that it's a multi-year rate plan. Meanwhile, there are no dollars at all in RIO riding on environmental incentives, And they don't have a demand-side management incentive because utilities don't do demand-side management programs. So I think rather the RIO does suggest that you could do some interesting things with performance incentive mechanisms and metrics in general, have more of them than in the past. But really, if you're not going to go down the road of a multi-year rate plan, what you really should be considering is greater use of Pimms for distributed energy resources. If you don't have a DSM PIM, get one. If you already have, by that I meant a conservation PIM. If you already have a conservation PIM, take the next steps of having something to incentivize the embrace of peak load management programs and perhaps also for distributed generation and storage.
We have a specific question on the RIO or RIO approach. You say RIO, I say RIO. You know, with its TOTEX approach, does the utility earn a profit on fuel costs in their revenue requirement, or is it just a pass-through? However it works, does the utility make more if fuel costs increase?
I don't know that one.
I don't think that the power is eligible for placement in the TOTEX. I think it's just operation and maintenance expenses. That's my answer. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm pretty sure that that's the case.
All right, great. So we've taken a lot of extra time. I really appreciate Tim and Mark and all of our participants that stayed with us on the phone. Again, if you'd like to sign up to make sure that you receive notices about our reports and webinars for this series, the Future Electric Utility Regulation series, please go to the link that we provided. All of our reports and our webinars are posted on our website. Thanks very much. Goodbye.